The silence is often louder than the noise. In the chaotic theater of modern geopolitics, where every tweet is a headline and every policy shift is broadcast in real-time high definition, we have become accustomed to a relentless barrage of information. We expect transparency, or at least the performance of it. Yet, in the early months of 2025 and bleeding into 2026, a peculiar quiet descended over one of the most provocative financial questions of the last century. It began with a burst of digital energy, a challenge thrown down from the highest echelons of the new efficiency-obsessed administration. The question was simple, primitive even, yet it carried the potential to shatter the bedrock of the global financial order. Elon Musk, standing alongside the returning architects of American policy, asked to see the gold. It was not a request for a spreadsheet or a reassured nod from a central banker. It was a demand for a physical, visual confirmation of the United States' sovereign inventory. The proposal was to open the doors of the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, to turn the unblinking eye of a camera onto the nation's wealth, and to prove once and for all that the empire still possessed its clothes. But then, the conversation vanished. The momentum which seemed poised to rip the curtain off a 70-year-old mystery dissipated into the ether. This sudden pivot away from the gold audit is not merely a change in the news cycle, it is a symptom of a much deeper, more terrifying anxiety that has plagued the American monetary system since the middle of the 20th century. To understand why that silence exists today, and to understand the gravity of what Musk and Trump were poking at, we cannot look at the present. The present is merely the crime scene. To find the weapon and the motive, we must travel back to the moment the gold was taken. We must return to the spring of 1933, to a nation on its knees where the government of the United States perpetrated what can only be described as the most sophisticated wealth transfer in human history, fundamentally altering the relationship between the citizen, the state, and the money in their pocket. The story does not begin with a robbery in the traditional sense. There were no masked men, no shattered glass, and no getaway cars. This heist was conducted with a pen, a piece of paper, and the full authority of the executive branch. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March of 1933, the United States was in the throes of an economic asphyxiation. And the Great Depression had not just broken the stock market, it had broken the spirit of the capitalist mechanism itself. Banks were collapsing by the thousands, not because they were insolvent in the long term, but because the panic was a self-fulfilling prophecy. In a fractional reserve system, faith is the only real currency, and in 1933, faith had evaporated. The American public, watching their life savings disappear behind the locked doors of shuttered banks, did the only rational thing a panicked population can do. They sought safety. And for 5,000 years of human history, safety has looked like one thing. It looks like gold. This flight to safety created a paradox that terrified the central planners of the era. The Federal Reserve was constrained by the gold standard. For every dollar printed, there had to be a corresponding amount of yellow metal backing it. As citizens withdrew their gold coins, eagles and double eagles, and hoarded them in coffee cans, floorboards, and garden burials, the base of the monetary supply shrank. The government's hands were tied. They could not inflate their way out of the debt deflation. They could not print money to stimulate the economy because the metal required to back that paper was disappearing into the private hoards of ordinary citizens. The gold standard, designed to be a leash on government power, was doing exactly what it was intended to do. It was preventing the state from debasing the currency at will. But to a government desperate to intervene, this leash felt like a noose. Roosevelt's solution was swift, brutal, and cloaked in the language of patriotism. He declared that the hoarding of gold was not merely an act of financial self-preservation, but an assault on the national recovery. The narrative was carefully crafted. The greedy individual was stalling the engine of the collective economy. On April 5th, 1933, less than a month into his presidency, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The language of the order was stark and uncompromising. It forbade the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. It was an unprecedented seizure of private property, justified by a national emergency that had no end date. The order required all persons to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. In exchange, they would receive paper currency at the rate of $20.67 per ounce. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in its speed and its framing. By criminalizing the ownership of monetary gold, the government effectively demonetized the only competitor to its own paper notes. They eliminated the exit strategy. If you did not trust the bank, you could no longer retreat to gold. You were forced to hold the very paper currency that was being mismanaged. The penalty for noncompliance was draconian, a $10,000 fine, an astronomical sum in the 1930s, or 10 years in prison. The message was clear. The wealth of the nation belonged to the state, and the individual was merely a custodian who could be revoked at any moment. This was the first act of the heist. It was the physical collection of the loot. Citizens, driven by a mix of patriotic duty and terrifying fear of prosecution, lined up at Federal Reserve banks. They handed over family heirlooms, savings, and the physical fruits of their labor. In return, they received paper certificates, promises from a government that was actively planning to devalue those very promises. It is critical to pause here and appreciate the psychological magnitude of this event. For generations, gold was money. It was tangible, immutable, and independent of political whim. When you held a gold coin, you held a piece of sovereignty. When that was stripped away and replaced with a Federal Reserve note, the power dynamic shifted entirely. You no longer owned money, you owned a claim on the government's credit. You went from being an owner of assets to a creditor of the state. This distinction is subtle to the uninitiated, but it is the fulcrum upon which all modern economics turns. By concentrating the physical gold in the hands of the Treasury, Roosevelt achieved total control over the monetary supply. He had captured the king on the chessboard. However, the confiscation was only the setup. The true theft, the sleight of hand that constitutes the heist, occurred shortly after the gold had been collected. Once the vast majority of the nation's gold was safely locked in government vaults, Roosevelt made his next move. In 1934, with the Gold Reserve Act, the president officially revalued gold. He raised the statutory price from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. On the surface, this sounds like a technical adjustment, a bureaucratic repricing. In reality, it was a default. By devaluing the dollar against gold, the government instantly increased the value of the hoard it had just confiscated by nearly 70%. They took the gold from the people at a discount, and then, by legislative fiat, declared it to be worth significantly more. The profit from this revaluation, the difference between the old price and the new price, did not go back to the citizens who had surrendered their savings. It went into a stabilization fund controlled by the Treasury, a slush fund used to manipulate currency markets without congressional oversight. The American people had been robbed of 40% of their purchasing power in a single stroke, and the government used the proceeds of that robbery to further cement its control over the economy. It was a masterclass in financial repression. The gold that was taken from the people was melted down, recast into bars, and eventually moved to a new, fortress-like depository built specifically for this purpose in the hills of Kentucky. A place that would become synonymous with impregnable wealth. Fort Knox. This brings us back to the present tension, the invisible thread connecting 1933 to 2026. Fort Knox was built to house the loot of 6102. It was constructed not just as a vault, but as a symbol. It was designed to project an image of absolute, unshakable security. The United States held the gold, therefore the United States dollar was as good as gold. This perception allowed the U.S. to construct the Bretton Woods system after World War II, establishing the dollar as the world reserve currency. The entire global economic architecture was built on the assumption that the gold in those vaults was real, that it was there, and that it belonged to the United States. But here lies the unsettling reality that Musk, in its recent provocation, touched upon. The physical audit of that gold has effectively ceased. We are told the gold is there. We are shown heavily redacted reports and assured by Treasury officials that the deep storage gold is safe. But the last time a comprehensive, transparent physical audit was conducted, where auditors actually drilled into the bars to test purity and weighed the inventory against the ledger, was during the Eisenhower administration. Since the early 1950s, the audit process has been a series of paper shuffling exercises, compartmentalized checks, and bureaucratic obfuscations. Why? If the gold is the bedrock of the American empire, why is the empire so terrified of showing it? In the corporate world, if a company refused a physical inventory audit for 70 years, its stock would go to zero, and its executives would be indicted for fraud. Yet, the entity that prints the world's reserve currency operates in a black box. This lack of transparency breeds theories, some wild, some dangerously plausible. It suggests that the gold confiscated in 1933 may no longer be sitting in dusty stacks in Kentucky. It suggests that over the decades, through the pressures of the Cold War, the gold pool of the 1960s, and the complex leasing arrangements of the modern era, the physical metal may have been mobilized. Financialization has turned everything into a derivative, and gold is no exception. Central banks routinely lease gold to bullion banks to earn interest. The bullion banks sell that gold into the market to suppress prices or satisfy demand. The central bank keeps the gold on its books as a receivable, but the physical bar is gone, melted down, and turned into jewelry in India or coins in China. This is the phenomenon of paper gold, where multiple claims exist for every single ounce of physical metal. If the confiscation of 1933 was the original sin of the American monetary century, the subsequent management of that gold represents the ongoing cover-up. We left off with the concept of paper gold, the shadow inventory that allows the global financial system to trade exponentially more metal than actually exists above ground. But to understand how this relates to the silence of 2026, to the sudden muting of Elon Musk's demand for transparency, we must dissect the peculiar legal and logistical purgatory in which the United States Ma'ar gold reserves currently reside. The official narrative is one of boring stability. 8,133 tons of gold, the largest reserve on the planet, resting undisturbed in the vaults of Fort Knox, West Point, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Yet, when one scrutinizes the bureaucratic machinery responsible for this hoard, the stability dissolves into a fog of semantic loopholes and accounting tricks. The gold is classified as deep storage. This term itself is a masterstroke of bureaucratic obfuscation. It implies permanence, safety, a status so secure that it need not be disturbed. In practice, however, this classification has been used as a shield against verification. Since the comprehensive audits of the Eisenhower era ceased, the Treasury has adopted a policy of statistical sampling. They do not open every vault. They do not weigh every bar. They certainly do not drill into the core of the bullion to ensure that what glitters is gold all the way through and not merely a tungsten slug coated in a few microns of history. Instead, they check the seals. They verify the paperwork. They audit the ledger, not the asset. In the corporate world, this would be akin to a warehouse manager confirming his inventory solely by reading his own clipboard, while refusing to look inside the boxes. The suspicion that the vaults might be lighter than advertised is not merely the domain of internet theorists. It is a structural necessity of the modern dollar system. For the US dollar to maintain its hegemony as the world's reserve currency, gold must be kept in check. Gold is the anti-dollar. It is the report card on the currency's health. When the price of gold skyrockets, it signals a vote of no confidence in the Federal Reserve. Therefore, it has been in the strategic interest of the United States government, particularly since the closing of the gold window in 1971 to manage the price of gold, to suppress it to keep the canary in the coal mine from singing too loudly. How do you suppress the price of an asset without selling it outright? You lease it. This is the dark heart of the heist theory. Central banks, operating through the Bank for International Settlements and major bullion banks in London and New York, can lease their gold out to the market. The gold leaves the vault, enters the commercial market, and is sold to jewelers in Mumbai or technology manufacturers in Shenzhen. The physical bar is gone, but on the central bank's balance sheet, the gold remains listed as an asset. It is simply categorized differently, perhaps as gold receivables or gold in process. The accounting remains whole while the vault becomes empty. This is rehypothecation applied to the sovereign wealth of a nation. It creates a situation where multiple parties claim ownership of the same ounce of gold. The US government claims it, the bullion bank that leased it claims it, and the final buyer who holds the physical metal owns it. It is a game of musical chairs played with the bedrock of the global economy, and the music has been playing for decades. This brings us to the terrifying implications of a true audit. If Elon Musk and the efficiency team were to force open the doors of Fort Knox and conduct a genuine independent assay, they would not just be counting bars. They would be auditing the credibility of the entire Western financial system. If the gold is there, but it is encumbered, meaning it has been leased out or used as collateral for other debts, then the United States does not truly own it. A leased asset is a liability in disguise. Discovering that the U.S. gold reserve is effectively double spent would trigger a catastrophic loss of faith in the dollar. Sovereign nations holding U.S. debt would rush for the exits. The price of physical gold would decouple entirely from the paper price, likely skyrocketing to levels that would make the current currency worthless. This context transforms the silence of early 2026 from a mystery into a necessity. When Musk demanded the audit, he was likely looking for inefficiency, for waste, for the typical government incompetence. What he may have stumbled upon is a structural secret so vital to national security that the top deep state, or simply the career technocrats who understand the plumbing of the dollar system, had to intervene. The quiet that followed his initial demands suggests a briefing. It suggests that someone sat the disruptors down and explained that this particular door cannot be opened without collapsing the building. Consider the geopolitical landscape of the mid-2020s. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanded members, have been aggressively accumulating physical gold. China, in particular, has been importing gold at a voracious pace, far exceeding its own production numbers. They are moving away from the dollar, building a trade settlement system backed by tangible commodities. They are calling the West's bluff. For the United States to admit, in this delicate moment, that its own inventory is compromised would be to hand the scepter of global economic power to the East on a silver platter. The gold in Fort Knox is no longer just wealth. It is a geopolitical bluffing chip. As long as the doors stay closed, the world has to assume the chips are there. To open the doors is to risk revealing a hand of nothing but air. Furthermore, we must scrutinize the good delivery bar standard. The bars in Fort Knox are largely coin melt bars. recast from the melted coins confiscated in 1933. They are not the standard 400-ounce London good delivery bars used in modern trade. They are dirty, of varying purity, and historically distinct. Even if the gold is physically there, making it tradable in the modern market would require a massive refining program, which in itself would take years and alert the markets. The gold in Fort Knox is in many ways a relic, frozen in the amber of 1933. It is an inventory that was stolen from the past to pay for the future, but the bill is coming due. The disconnect between the digital reality of Bitcoin and high-frequency trading and the analog reality of cold, heavy bars sitting in a Kentucky vault is becoming impossible to ignore. The systems are incompatible. One relies on absolute transparency, the blockchain, the other on absolute secrecy. As we move toward the climax of this investigation, we have to ask, what happened in that room when the audit talk stopped? Did Musk see the ledger and realize the futility? Or was a deal made? A deal to keep the illusion alive for just a little longer, to allow for a transition to a new system before the old one is exposed as a hollow shell? The silence suggests that the heist of 1933 is still in progress. The government didn't just steal the gold once. They have been stealing the truth about it every day for 70 years. The history of the American gold reserves is not a history of accounting. It is a history of carefully managed theater. To fully grasp the magnitude of the silence that has descended upon the Musk-Trump inquiry in 2026, we must examine the few rare instances when the curtain was briefly pulled back, only to reveal more shadows than substance. The government's defense against the accusation of theft has always been a performance of transparency, a pantomime of verification designed to satisfy the public without actually proving anything. Consider the events of 1974. Following the Nixon shock in 1971, which severed the final link between the dollar and gold, rumors began to swirl that the vaults were empty. The public anxiety was palpable. The dollar was floating in a void, untethered to reality. In response, the Treasury orchestrated a media event. They allowed a select group of journalists and members of Congress into Fort Knox for the first time since the 1930s. The visitors were paraded past a single vault compartment. They saw stacks of glimmering bars. One congressman was allowed to lift a bar, feeling its dense, unmistakable gravity. Photos were taken, headlines were written. The panic subsided. But to the forensic eye, the visit was a farce. There was no assaying, there was no drilling. There was no way to verify that the metal was gold throughout, nor was there any way to know if the stack shown was the only stack remaining. It was a Potemkin village of bullion, a stage set constructed to reassure a nervous populace that the empire's credit was still good. Fast forward to the modern era, and the cracks in the facade have become gaping chasms. The most damning evidence that the United States gold inventory has been compromised comes not from domestic auditors, but from foreign sovereigns. For decades, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York acted as the custodian for the gold of the free world. Germany, fearing a Soviet invasion during the Cold War, stored the vast majority of its gold reserves in Manhattan. It was a logical arrangement, keep the money safe in the fortress of the world's superpower. But in 2012, a new generation of German politicians began to ask the uncomfortable question, is our gold still there? The Bundesbank requested the repatriation of a significant portion of its reserves, 300 tons of gold. In a normal logistical operation, moving 300 tons of metal is a matter of security and shipping. It should take weeks, perhaps months. Instead, the Federal Reserve declared that the process would take 7 years. 7 years to move an asset that was supposedly sitting on a pallet in a basement in Lower Manhattan. The delay was inexplicable, unless the gold wasn't there. The theories that emerged from this delay form the backbone of the Great Gold Heist narrative. The consensus among skeptics is that the Federal Reserve did not have Germany's gold. They had leased it out, sold it into the market to suppress prices during the volatile 1990s and 2000s. When Germany asked for it back, the Fed was caught in a short squeeze. They had to scramble to acquire new gold on the open market, melt it down, and recast it to fulfill the German request. This theory was all but confirmed when the gold finally arrived in Frankfurt. The bars were not the original vintage bars Germany had deposited decades prior. They were fresh bars with new stamps. The original inventory was gone. The United States had effectively been caught running a fractional reserve banking scheme with other nations' sovereign wealth. This context is vital for understanding the truncated audit of 2026. When Donald Trump and Elon Musk began their crusade for government efficiency, they were operating on the premise that the government is merely incompetent. They assumed the lack of an audit is due to laziness or bureaucratic inertia. But the German episode suggests something far more malevolent. The lack of an audit is a strategic necessity. If the United States were to open the vaults today and reveal that the 8,133 tons of deep storage gold is actually a mix of leased paper claims and encumbered assets, it would not just be a scandal, it would be an act of geopolitical suicide. The silence we are hearing now is the sound of that realization sinking in. It is the moment the dog caught the car. Musk, a creature of mathematics and hard engineering, likely demanded the data, and the data he received likely indicated that a true audit is impossible because the asset has been financialized out of existence. The cold case of 1933 is not cold. It is radioactive. We must also scrutinize the strange, solitary visit of Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin in 2017. He flew to Fort Knox, became the first secretary since 1948 to enter the vault, and emerged with a single dismissive tweet. "Glad gold is safe." It was a statement so glib, so devoid of detail, that it felt like a mockery. It was the trust me of a man who knows the game is rigged. Contrast this with the forensic obsession of the cryptocurrency generation, to whom Musk speaks. In the world of Bitcoin, don't trust, verify is the religion. Every Satoshi is accounted for on a public ledger. To this generation, a tweet from a politician saying it's safe is not proof. It is a red flag. The collision between these two worlds, the opaque, trust-based system of the 20th century and the transparent, verification-based system of the 21st, is the friction point of our current history. The econ empire of the United States was built on the former. It relies on the world simply believing the myth of American exceptionalism. But myths require maintenance. They require that no one looks behind the curtain. The tragedy of the 2026 audit attempt is that it threatened to destroy the myth right at the moment the U.S. needed it most. With the national debt spiraling past sustainable levels and the interest on that debt consuming the budget, the illusion of solvency is the only thing keeping the bond market from collapsing. Therefore, the story has shifted. It is no longer about stealing the gold in the sense of theft for personal gain. It is about the stealing of the gold for the preservation of the state. The gold was sacrificed to the altar of the dollar. It was sold off bit by bit, ounce by ounce, to manipulate interest rates, to fight currency wars, and to maintain the facade of a unipolar world. The inventory that Musk asked to see is likely a graveyard of IOUs. As we approach the final act of this script, we must grapple with the consequences of this silence. If the gold is gone, or if it is so encumbered by legal claims that it cannot be moved, then the US dollar is effectively a fiat currency in the purest, most dangerous sense. It is backed by nothing but F-35s and the inertia of history. The heist of 1933 was the beginning of a long con, a 90-year Ponzi scheme where new debts are used to pay off old ones, and the collateral, the gold, was pawned decades ago. The reason there is no update on the gold stock is because an update would be an obituary. The empire has no clothes, and for a brief moment in 2025, Elon Musk held up a mirror. The silence that followed is the sound of the mirror being hastily covered back up. We arrive now at the terminal point of this investigation, the place where history collides with the immediate future. The silence surrounding the 2026 gold audit is not an absence of information. It is the most deafening piece of information we have received in a century. It serves as the final unspoken verdict on the experiment that began with Executive Order 6102. When Franklin Roosevelt criminalized the possession of gold in 1933, he didn't just seize metal, he seized the economic soul of the American citizen. He broke the ancient contract that stated money was property, replacing it with the modern delusion that money is debt. Now, 90 years later, the bill for that delusion has arrived, and the coffers used to guarantee it appear to be empty. The sudden muting of Elon Musk and the Efficiency Commission suggests a realization that is too dangerous to broadcast. The United States is likely technically insolvent. If the gold in Fort Knox is encumbered, leased, or rehypothecated, then the Federal Reserve note is a check written on an account that was closed decades ago. The heist is complete. The gold that was taken from your grandparents was not saved for a rainy day. It was spent to buy the American century. It funded the wars, the welfare state, the bailouts, and the illusion of infinite prosperity. The reason there is no update on the inventory is because the inventory is no longer an asset. It is a crime scene. This leads us to a terrifying question. If they stole the gold in 1933 to reset the system, what will they steal next? The logic of the state does not change. When a government faces a debt crisis it cannot solve, it turns on its own citizens. In 1933, the target was physical gold. In the 2020s, the target is purchasing power itself. The silence from the administration is a signal that the solution to the current debt spiral will not be a return to hard money, but a shift to total control. We are likely standing on the precipice of a new executive order, one not written on paper, but coded into software. The transition to central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, is the digital echo of 1933. Just as Roosevelt forced people out of gold and into paper to control them, the next move will be to force people out of paper and into programmable tokens. The audit was the last off-ramp. A transparent accounting of the gold could have restored trust, re-anchored the dollar, and imposed discipline on Washington. By refusing to take that ramp, the powers that be have signaled that they intend to drive the current system until the wheels fall off. The silence is an admission that there is no plan B that involves honest money. The strategy is to inflate the debt away, to devalue the currency until the numbers on the screen are meaningless, and the only wealth that survives is the wealth that the government cannot reach. For the individual, the lesson of this century-long saga is brutal but liberating. The state is not a custodian of your wealth, it is a competitor for it. The Americans who trusted the government in 1933 and handed over their gold were decimated by inflation. The ones who disobeyed, who hid their wealth, who understood the nature of the heist, preserved their legacy. Today, the dynamic is identical. The econ empire is crumbling under the weight of its own lies. The refusal to count the gold is not definitive proof of bankruptcy, but it is a terrifying signal that the empire fears it might be true. The mystery of the great American Gold Heist is not about where the bars are. It is about where the power lies. In 1933, the power shifted from the people to the state. The silence of 2026 is the sound of the state realizing it has lost that power to the unforgiving reality of math. The gold may be gone, scattered to the winds of global trade, sitting in vaults in Shanghai or Zurich. But the truth is finally home. The American inventory is not in Fort Knox. It is in the history books, a memory of a time when a dollar was worth a dollar. As we watch the Musk-Trump narrative fade into the background, replaced by the next distraction, remember this. They didn't stop talking about the gold because it was boring. They stopped talking about it because it was the only thing that mattered. The vault is closed, the audit is dead, the heist is over. The only question left is, what do you hold in your hand right now? Is it a promise from a bankrupt empire, or is it something real? History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. 1933 was the warning. Today is the reality. If you're waiting for that government to tell you the truth about the money, you have already lost. Become your own central bank. Because when the music finally stops, the only chair left will be the one you built yourself.